Life has a funny way of delivering its biggest punches when you least expect them, often disguised as something mundane, like an envelope in the mail. For me, that envelope didn't just contain a piece of paper. It held a declaration of war, aimed directly at the heart of my family. It all started with my mother, a woman whose resilience I'd always admired, but whose vulnerability had become increasingly apparent over the years. She lived in this charming, if slightly dated, two-bedroom apartment, a place she'd called home for nearly 3 decades. It was more than just walls and a roof. It was a repository of memories, a sanctuary filled with the scent of her homemade bread and the soft hum of her old sewing machine. She'd raised me there, navigated countless life changes within those familiar rooms, and honestly, I thought she'd live out her days there, surrounded by her beloved plants and the quiet comfort of routine. I'd always made it a point to visit her every Sunday. It was our ritual. We'd share coffee, talk about the week, and I'd usually fix whatever minor thing had decided to break. A leaky faucet, a flickering light. On this particular Sunday, the air felt different. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that usually fills you with a sense of renewal, but when I walked in, I was immediately struck by a silence that was heavier than usual. My mother, usually bustling about, was sitting at her kitchen table, a crumpled piece of paper clutched in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, etched with a fear I hadn't seen since my father passed away. My heart lurched. Something was terribly wrong. I sat down opposite her, gently taking the paper from her grasp. It was an eviction notice. Not just any eviction notice, mind you, but a formal, legally dense document, demanding she vacate the premises in 30 days. 30 days. For a woman who had lived in the same place for 30 years. My eyes scanned the boilerplate language, the cold, impersonal legal jargon that masked a truly cruel intent. The reason cited was a vague claim of property redevelopment, a term often used as a convenient excuse by landlords looking to push out long-term, rent-controlled tenants. But even a quick glance told me this notice was riddled with inconsistencies, small errors that immediately raised my antennae. You see, I'm not just some casual observer here. My professional life, for the better part of 15 years, has revolved around the intricate, often convoluted world of real estate law. I've spent countless hours poring over property deeds, zoning regulations, tenancy agreements, and the endless permutations of landlord-tenant disputes. I've seen the good, the bad, and the downright ugly sides of property ownership. So when I read that notice, it wasn't just a son looking at a threat to his mother. It was a lawyer spotting the first cracks in a carefully constructed facade. My initial reaction was a surge of protective fury, a primal instinct to shield my mother from this injustice. But beneath that anger, a colder, more calculated resolve began to solidify. This wasn't just about my mother's apartment. It was about the principle, about the blatant disregard for human dignity and legal process. I looked at my mother, her eyes still wide with fear, and I made a silent promise. This wouldn't stand. Not on my watch. The landlord, a man named Victor Thorne, was a name I knew, at least by reputation. He was a shadowy figure in the local real estate scene, known for acquiring older properties, often through aggressive tactics, and then flipping them for substantial profit. He had a track record of cutting corners, skirting regulations, and generally operating in a moral gray area that most decent people wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. His company, Thorne Properties, had a slick website and an even slicker legal team, but whispered rumors always followed his deals like a bad smell. He was the kind of man who saw buildings not as homes, but as assets, and people not as tenants, but as obstacles to maximizing his bottom line. My first step was to reassure my mother. I held her hands, looked her directly in the eye, and told her, with every ounce of conviction I possessed, that she was not going anywhere. I explained that this notice was flawed, that we had rights, and that I would fight this with everything I had. The relief that washed over her face was palpable, but the fear remained, a testament to the power an eviction notice holds over someone who feels powerless. That fear fueled my resolve even further. I took the notice home with me, spreading it out on my dining table, surrounded by my own legal texts and case files. I started dissecting it, line by line, word by word. The address was correct, the dates were there, but the specific legal code cited for the redevelopment clause was outdated, referring to a section of the municipal code that had been amended years ago. A small detail, perhaps, but a significant one in the eyes of the law. It suggested either sloppiness or, more likely, a deliberate attempt to confuse and intimidate, hoping a vulnerable tenant wouldn't catch the discrepancy. I spent the next few days in a blur of research. I pulled up public records on Thorn Properties, examining their corporate structure, their registered agents, and their portfolio of properties. What I found was a sprawling, complex web of limited liability companies, shell corporations within shell corporations, all seemingly designed to obscure ownership and liability. It was a classic tactic for someone who preferred to operate in the shadows, making it difficult to trace assets or hold anyone personally accountable. This wasn't just one building. Thorn Properties owned dozens, if not hundreds, across the city, many of them older, rent-controlled buildings similar to my mother's. My initial thought, landlord striving to improve neglected properties. I received a cryptic email, seemingly from a burner account, warning me to drop the investigation. It contained details about my personal life that only someone with access to private information would know. It was a clear intimidation tactic, a chilling reminder that they were watching, that they knew who I was and what I was doing. For a moment, a cold wave of fear washed over me. I thought of my family, the fragile peace I had found since their move. Was I putting them at risk again? Was this fight worth everything? I confided in Dr. Reed, my voice tight with a mixture of anger and apprehension. She listened, her expression grim. "This is what they do," she said, her voice devoid of surprise. "They use fear as a weapon. They want you to back down. Don't give them the satisfaction. We're getting close. That's why they're lashing out." Her words, and the unwavering support of David and Lena, helped me push past the fear. The email, instead of deterring me, hardened my resolve. It was proof that we were hitting a nerve, that our collective efforts were making an impact. We decided to go public. Lena, with her connections, arranged a press conference outside one of Thorn's most notoriously neglected buildings. We gathered a diverse group of tenants, brave enough to share their stories publicly, their faces etched with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. Dr. Reed and I stood beside them, prepared to explain the legal implications. David, ever the meticulous organizer, had prepared a detailed fact sheet outlining Thorn's pattern of abuse. The day of the press conference was tense. The air crackled with anticipation. Local news crews arrived, their cameras poised. As Maria, her voice trembling but firm, began to speak about the years of neglect and the constant fear, a palpable shift occurred. Her story, raw and honest, resonated. Other tenants followed, their narratives weaving a tapestry of systemic abuse. I spoke next, laying out the legal framework of our impending class action lawsuit, emphasizing the scale of Thorn's operations and the deliberate nature of their actions. Dr. Reed added her formidable voice, lending credibility and gravitas to our accusations. The press conference was a success. The story spread like wildfire, picked up by local and even some national news outlets. The narrative of Thorn Properties as a benevolent developer was shattered, replaced by the image of a ruthless corporation preying on the vulnerable. The public outcry was immediate and widespread. City officials who had long turned a blind eye or been swayed by Thorn's political donations were now forced to take notice. But the media attention also brought increased scrutiny, and, as expected, a furious backlash from Thorn Properties. Their PR machine went into overdrive, issuing statements dismissing our claims as fabrications, accusing us of slander, and threatening legal action. Their lawyers sent cease and desist letters to every tenant who had spoken out, attempting to silence them. They even launched a smear campaign against Dr. Reed and me, digging into our pasts, attempting to find any weakness, any vulnerability they could exploit. My own past, particularly the circumstances surrounding my family's displacement, became a target. They tried to paint me as a disgruntled former tenant, with a personal vendetta, seeking revenge rather than justice. They attempted to undermine my credibility, suggesting my motivations were purely self-serving. It was a calculated attack designed to isolate me and discredit the entire movement. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to crush me. The relentless attacks, the constant pressure, the knowledge that I was up against an entity with seemingly infinite resources. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly exhausted. The long nights poring over documents, the endless meetings, the emotional toll of hearing so many heartbreaking stories, it was all catching up to me. I thought of my parents, living in a small, unfamiliar town, rebuilding their lives. Had I made the right choice to throw myself back into this fight? Was I strong enough to see it through? I found myself walking the familiar streets near my old family home, the one Thorn had taken. The building stood there, a testament to their victory, its windows dark and empty, awaiting the inevitable luxury renovation. I stood across the street, watching it, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The anger, the grief, the sense of powerlessness, it all came rushing back. But then, a different emotion surfaced, not despair, but defiance. I remembered Maria's trembling hands, her unwavering hope despite everything. I remembered Lena's calm determination, David's boundless energy, Dr. Reed's quiet strength. I remembered the faces of the tenants at the press conference, their courage in speaking truth to power. This wasn't just about my personal pain anymore. It was about all of them. It was about justice for every family displaced, every life uprooted, every community fractured by Thorn's greed. I took a deep breath, the cold night air filling my lungs. The fear was still there, a faint echo, but it was overshadowed by a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer just a lawyer fighting a case. I was a part of something larger, a collective voice rising against injustice. And I wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The next phase of the battle involved preparing the actual class action lawsuit. This was a monumental undertaking. We needed to identify a sufficient number of plaintiffs who met the criteria for class certification, meticulously document their individual damages, and craft a legal argument that would withstand Thorn's inevitable onslaught. David, with his incredible organizational skills, managed the intake of new clients, ensuring every detail was recorded. Lena continued her outreach, bringing in more brave souls, willing to join the fight. Dr. Reed and I focused on the legal strategy, anticipating Thorn's counter-arguments and building a robust case. We decided to target not only Thorn Properties as a corporate entity, but also specific individuals within its leadership, particularly those directly responsible for implementing the predatory strategies. We wanted to expose the human faces behind the corporate greed, to hold them personally accountable for the suffering they had inflicted. This was a risky move, as it would invite even more aggressive retaliation, but we believed it was necessary to send a clear message. The legal filings alone were hundreds of pages long, detailing years of alleged misconduct, supported by countless affidavits, internal company documents we had managed to unearth through various channels, and expert analyses of their business practices. We submitted the lawsuit to the court, a collective roar against a seemingly invincible foe. The day we filed, a small group of tenants, including Maria, gathered with us outside the courthouse. There were no cameras this time, just a quiet sense of shared victory and anticipation. It was a small step, but a significant one. The legal battle officially began. Thorn's response was swift and aggressive. They filed motions to dismiss, motions to strike, and motions to compel arbitration for individual tenants, attempting to fragment our unified front. Their legal team, a phalanx of high-priced corporate lawyers, employed every tactic in the book to delay, obfuscate, and overwhelm us. They demanded endless discovery, burying us in requests for documents and depositions, hoping to exhaust our limited resources and break our spirits. I spent my days in courtrooms, in deposition rooms, and in our makeshift war room, battling Thorn's lawyers. The arguments were often dense, technical, and emotionally draining. They tried to portray our plaintiffs as opportunists, their claims as exaggerated, their suffering as self-inflicted. I had to maintain a professional demeanor, even as my blood boiled at their callous disregard for human lives. One particular deposition stands out. I was questioning Thorne's head of property management, a man named Robert Sterling, whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. He was slick, evasive, and utterly devoid of empathy. I pressed him on the deliberate neglect of Maria's building, the unaddressed leaks, the heating failures. He feigned ignorance, claiming budget constraints, unforeseen circumstances, and the challenges of managing older properties. I presented him with internal memos we'd obtained, showing explicit instructions to delay non-emergency repairs in specific buildings, precisely the ones we were targeting. The memos, while not overtly stating the intent to drive out tenants, clearly demonstrated a pattern of prioritizing cost-cutting over tenant well-being, particularly in rent-controlled units. Sterling's composure finally cracked, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He mumbled something about business decisions, about maximizing shareholder value. I looked him directly in the eye and asked him if maximizing shareholder value was worth destroying people's homes, their lives, their sense of security. He scoffed, his face hardening. "That's a rhetorical question," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We operate within the law." His arrogance, his utter lack of remorse fueled my resolve. I knew then that we weren't just fighting a company, we were fighting an ideology, a worldview that placed profit above all else, that dehumanized people for the sake of a balance sheet. The legal process was agonizingly slow, a war of attrition. Months turned into a year. Funding became a constant concern. Our small team operated on a shoestring budget, relying on pro bono hours, small grants from sympathetic foundations, and the sheer goodwill of our allies. Thorne, on the other hand, had seemingly bottomless pockets. They flew in expert witnesses, hired private investigators to dig up dirt on our plaintiffs and our legal team, and flooded the court with paperwork designed to drain our time and resources. There were moments of despair, moments when the sheer enormity of the task threatened to overwhelm me. I'd sit alone in my apartment late at night, surrounded by legal documents, questioning if we could truly win against such a powerful adversary. The personal toll was immense. My social life had dwindled to nothing. My waking hours were consumed by the case, and my dreams were often haunted by the faces of the tenants, their stories replaying in my mind. But then I'd receive a call from Lena, reporting another successful community outreach meeting, or an email from David, detailing a new piece of evidence he'd unearthed. Or I'd see Maria at a meeting, her spirit unbroken, her belief in our fight unwavering. Those moments were my anchors, pulling me back from the brink, reminding me why I was doing this. The public support we had garnered after the press conference slowly began to translate into more tangible help. Local politicians, sensing a shift in public opinion, started to voice their support. A few smaller law firms, inspired by our tenacity, offered to contribute pro bono hours. A local investigative journalist, intrigued by the depth of our case, began to publish a series of articles detailing Thorne's practices, adding another layer of public pressure. The tide, ever so slowly, was beginning to turn. The legal battle was far from over, but we had managed to hold our ground, to withstand Thorne's initial assault. We had exposed their tactics, rallied a community, and built a formidable, if grassroots, coalition. We had built a platform, a voice, for those who had been silenced for too long. The influx of new legal minds was a welcome storm. A small army of bright, dedicated attorneys from those pro bono firms descended upon our makeshift war room, their initial skepticism quickly replaced by a fervent belief in our cause. They pored over the documents David and I had painstakingly assembled, their sharp eyes catching nuances we might have missed in our exhaustion. They brought with them not just expertise but also resources, paralegals, researchers, access to legal databases that had been beyond our reach. Our small team, once just a handful of dedicated individuals, now swelled into a force capable of truly challenging Thorne. Their first assessment was both encouraging and sobering. We had a strong case, they confirmed, particularly regarding the pattern of negligence and the deliberate obfuscation of information. But Thorn, they warned, was a Goliath with an army of its own, and they would fight dirty. This was not just a legal battle, but a war of attrition, a test of wills and resources. Sarah Jenkins, the investigative journalist, proved to be an invaluable ally. Her series of articles, meticulously researched and compellingly written, peeled back the layers of Thorn's corporate facade. She exposed their aggressive expansion strategies, their history of environmental violations in other regions, and the surprisingly consistent pattern of suppressing dissent. Her reporting was a public education, turning abstract legal jargon into a human story of corporate greed and community suffering. The articles were picked up by national news outlets, and suddenly, Thorn Industries, a name once synonymous with innovation and progress, was being openly questioned, its stock taking a noticeable hit. This was a pressure point, a vulnerability we hadn't anticipated, but were quick to exploit. Thorn's initial response was predictable, a carefully orchestrated public relations counteroffensive. They issued statements denying all allegations, portraying us as a small, misguided group attempting to extort a reputable company. They highlighted their charitable contributions, their job creation, their supposed commitment to the community. They even tried to discredit Sarah Jenkins, suggesting her reporting was biased and sensationalist. But the tide of public opinion, once turned, was difficult to reverse. Our story had taken root, yet, beneath the surface of this public display, Thorn's legal team was far from idle. We felt their presence in subtle, insidious ways. Our servers experienced unexplained outages. We received anonymous emails containing thinly veiled threats, often referencing details about our personal lives that felt chillingly specific. My car, parked outside my apartment, was vandalized. A clear message left on the windshield: back off. These were not random acts. They were calculated attempts to intimidate, to wear us down, to make us question the safety of our endeavor. These incidents, while unsettling, also served to steel my resolve. They were proof that we were hitting a nerve, that our actions were having an impact. My anchors became more crucial than ever. David, always the calm, analytical mind, would meticulously document every suspicious event, turning potential fear into actionable intelligence. Maria, her eyes blazing with an unyielding fire, would remind me of the faces of the community members, their hopes pinned on us. She organized neighborhood watches, creating a network of vigilance that countered the feeling of isolation. The pro bono legal team, led by a sharp, seasoned litigator named Eleanor Vance, took the lead on the formal discovery process. This was where the real fight began. We demanded access to Thorn's internal documents, their environmental impact assessments, their safety protocols, their communications regarding the facility. Thorn, as expected, fought us every step of the way, burying us in mountains of irrelevant paper, redacting crucial information, and citing proprietary secrets. It was a frustrating, exhausting dance, a battle fought over every single piece of paper. But David, with his relentless investigative spirit, continued to work his own channels. He spent countless nights poring over public records, cross-referencing data, and cultivating sources. One evening he called me, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. I could hear the rustle of papers in the background. "I think I have something," he said. "Something big." He had been contacted by an anonymous source, someone claiming to be a former mid-level manager at Thorn, disillusioned by the company's practices. This source, terrified of retaliation, had provided David with an encrypted drive. It contained a trove of internal communications, engineering reports, and even an internal audit from several years prior. The audit, David explained, detailed significant structural flaws in the facility's waste management system, flaws that were dismissed by senior management as too costly to fix. Even more damning, there were emails discussing how to downplay these risks in public statements and how to circumvent certain regulatory hurdles. This was more than just negligence. This was deliberate concealment, a pattern of prioritizing profit over safety. It was the smoking gun we had been searching for. The anonymity of the source was a challenge, but The documents themselves were irrefutable. Eleanor Vance and her team immediately recognized the significance. This evidence, if authenticated and properly introduced, could blow Thorne's defense out of the water. Sarah Jenkins was ecstatic. She held off on publishing anything immediately, understanding the need to verify the documents and prepare the legal strategy, but her journalistic instincts told her this was the story of a lifetime. Thorne, sensing the shift in our offensive, escalated their intimidation. The anonymous threats became more direct, mentioning my family by name. My apartment was broken into, but nothing of value was taken. Instead, a single, dead bird was left on my pillow, a grotesque message. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in my stomach. I moved in with David for a few weeks, his quiet strength, a comforting presence in the face of such malice. Maria insisted on having a rotating schedule of community members watch over our temporary office, turning the threat into an opportunity for collective action. The strain was immense. Sleep became a luxury, often interrupted by nightmares of the bird, or distorted images of Thorne's legal team, their faces sneering. My health began to suffer. I lost weight, my nerves frayed. There were moments, late at night, when the enormity of it all threatened to crush me. The thought of giving up, of retreating to a quiet life, was a powerful siren song. But then I would think of Maria, her unwavering belief, and the faces of the children whose future we were fighting for. I would think of David, his quiet dedication, risking his own safety for this cause. And the anger, cold and righteous, would return, fueling my resolve. I could not, would not, give up. Eleanor Vance filed a motion to compel discovery, citing Thorne's systematic stonewalling and presenting the judge with a redacted summary of the anonymous documents as evidence of their deliberate concealment. The judge, a no-nonsense woman known for her strict adherence to legal procedure, scheduled an emergency hearing. The courtroom was packed, Sarah Jenkins and other reporters scribbling furiously in the press row. Thorne's lawyers, a phalanx of expensive suits, argued vehemently against our motion, claiming the documents were likely fabricated, an attempt to smear their client. They tried to paint me as a reckless activist, driven by personal vendettas, but Eleanor was relentless, calmly and systematically dismantling their arguments, demonstrating Thorne's pattern of obstruction. She spoke with a quiet authority that commanded the room, her voice echoing with the weight of legal precedent. The judge listened, her expression unreadable. After 2 grueling hours of arguments, she delivered her ruling. She found Thorne in contempt of court for failing to comply with discovery requests. She ordered them to produce all requested documents, unredacted, within 2 weeks, under threat of severe sanctions. Furthermore, she hinted at the possibility of an adverse inference instruction to the jury if Thorne continued its obstructive behavior, meaning the jury could be told to assume the withheld evidence would have been unfavorable to Thorne. It was a significant victory, a powerful rebuke to Thorne's tactics. The news spread like wildfire. Sarah Jenkins' follow-up articles were front-page news, detailing the judge's ruling and the damning implications of Thorne's concealment. The public outcry intensified. Local politicians, who had previously offered only cautious support, now began to speak out more forcefully, calling for regulatory investigations into Thorne's practices. The State Environmental Protection Agency announced an immediate review of Thorne's permits. Thorne's stock plummeted further. There were whispers of internal turmoil, of board members questioning the CEO's handling of the crisis. The pressure on them was immense, coming from all sides: legal, public, financial, and political. Emboldened by our victory and the public spotlight, another former Thorne employee came forward, this time openly. A retired engineer named Mr. Henderson, he had worked on the initial design of the waste management system and had personally raised concerns about the structural flaws years ago, only to be ignored and eventually sidelined. He corroborated the anonymous documents, adding his own detailed testimony about Thorne's culture of cutting corners and prioritizing cost savings over safety. His testimony was a powerful human element, providing an insider's perspective that was impossible to dismiss. Mr. Henderson became a star witness, his quiet dignity and technical expertise lending immense credibility to our case. His willingness to speak out, despite the clear risks, inspired others. We began receiving more calls, more anonymous tips, more pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The dam had broken. The physical and emotional toll, however, remained. The victories, while exhilarating, were fleeting moments of relief in a constant state of high alert. I found myself relying heavily on David's calm presence, his steady hand. Our late-night strategy sessions often dissolved into quiet conversations about the future, about what we would do when this was all over. Maria, ever the community organizer, ensured I ate, rested, and connected with the people we were fighting for. She reminded me that I was not alone, that this was a collective effort. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of depositions, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the dead bird framed on my pillow. The anger had receded, replaced by a profound weariness. I felt hollowed out, stretched thin. The fight felt endless, the enemy omnipresent. A wave of despair washed over me. What if it was all for nothing? What if Thorn, with its endless resources, eventually crushed us? Then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Maria. A picture of the community garden, now bursting with life, tended by children. A caption, "We are growing. We are strong. Do not forget." And just like that, the hollow feeling began to recede. The despair gave way to a quiet determination. I closed my eyes, picturing the vibrant green of the garden, the innocent faces of the children. This was not just about winning a lawsuit. It was about protecting a future. It was about justice. Thorn, reeling from the judge's ruling and the mounting public pressure, made a surprising move. They offered to settle. It was a substantial sum, far more than we had initially hoped for, enough to compensate the victims and fund a complete overhaul of the environmental remediation. Their legal team, clearly under new directives, approached us with a veneer of conciliation. Eleanor Vance advised caution. A settlement, she explained, would avoid the risks of a jury trial, which could always be unpredictable. It would provide immediate relief to the victims. But it would also allow Thorn to avoid a public admission of guilt, to escape the full scrutiny of a trial, and potentially to continue their harmful practices elsewhere. We held a meeting with the community leaders, Maria at the forefront. The debate was passionate, the emotions raw. Some, exhausted by the fight, favored the settlement, seeing it as a tangible victory and an end to the ordeal. Others, including Maria, argued vehemently that a settlement, without a full airing of the truth in court, would be a betrayal of everything we had fought for. It would allow Thorn to buy their way out of accountability. I listened to both sides, weighing the options. The money was tempting, the promise of an end to the relentless pressure alluring. But Maria's words resonated deeply. We had exposed their tactics, rallied a community, and built something more than just a legal case. We had built a movement, and a movement demanded more than just a payout. It demanded justice, accountability, and a precedent that would deter other corporations from similar abuses. My decision was clear. We would not settle. We would go to trial. Eleanor Vance, though initially advocating for settlement, respected our decision. "Good," she said, her eyes gleaming with a renewed fire. "This is where we truly make history." The preparations for trial intensified. Our war room became a hive of activity. Day and night, lawyers, paralegals, David, Maria, and I worked almost around the clock. We sifted through every document, prepared every witness, rehearsed every argument. Mr. Henderson, the former engineer, became a central figure in our trial strategy, his calm demeanor and detailed testimony a powerful weapon. Thorn, realizing we would not back down, launched a final desperate offensive. They filed a motion to dismiss the case, citing a technicality related to the statute of limitations, a last-ditch attempt to avoid trial. It was a complex legal maneuver, designed to overwhelm us with legal jargon and obscure precedents. Eleanor Vance and her team worked feverishly to counter the motion. We knew this was Thorne's final gambit before facing a jury. The stakes were higher than ever. If the motion was granted, years of work, of sacrifice, of struggle would be erased. The hearing for the motion to dismiss was another tense affair. Thorne's lawyers were aggressive, confident that they had found a loophole. But Eleanor, armed with our meticulously researched counter-arguments, was equally formidable. She presented case law, legal interpretations, and even historical context that systematically dismantled Thorne's claims. She argued that Thorne's deliberate concealment of information had prevented us from discovering the full extent of the harm within the statute of limitations, and that their own actions should preclude them from using such a defense. The judge, having seen Thorne's obstructive behavior firsthand, listened intently. Her questions were pointed, her gaze unwavering. After a lengthy deliberation, she returned to the bench, her expression stern. She denied Thorne's motion to dismiss. The relief that washed over me was almost physical, a wave of tension releasing from my shoulders. It was another monumental victory, clearing the path for the trial. Thorne had exhausted their legal maneuvers. They would have to face us in court. The trial date was set. The legal battle was far from over, but we had managed to hold our ground, to withstand Thorne's initial assault, their sophisticated legal tactics, and their insidious intimidation. We had exposed their tactics, rallied a community, and built a movement that was now poised to demand justice in the highest court. The tide had not just turned. It was now a powerful, undeniable current, carrying us towards a reckoning that Thorne Industries could no longer avoid. The denial of Thorne's motion to dismiss was not merely a procedural victory. It was a psychological turning point, a powerful affirmation that our fight was legitimate, that our voices would be heard. The air in our small, makeshift war room, once thick with anxiety and the scent of stale coffee, now hummed with a renewed, almost electric energy. The trial date loomed, a fixed point on the horizon, and every fiber of our collective being was geared towards it. Our legal team, a formidable alliance of dedicated pro bono attorneys and environmental law specialists, plunged into a final, exhaustive phase of preparation. Day bled into night as we meticulously organized mountains of evidence, scientific reports detailing the contamination, internal Thorne documents unearthed through painstaking discovery, medical records correlating illnesses with the exposure, and the heart-wrenching personal testimonies of those whose lives had been irrevocably altered. My role, once a whirlwind of community organizing and public advocacy, now centered on coordinating these efforts, ensuring every piece of the puzzle fit, every witness was prepared, every argument polished to an undeniable sheen. I spent countless hours with our key witnesses. There was Maria, her voice still trembling but her resolve unyielding, recounting the slow, insidious decline of her once vibrant family. There was Dr. Eris, the courageous whistleblower, whose technical jargon I helped translate into plain, understandable language, ensuring the jury would grasp the deliberate scientific malfeasance. And there were the many others, the farmers, the factory workers, the retirees, each bearing a unique burden, yet all united by the common thread of Thorne's negligence. Preparing them for the cross-examination, for the scrutiny, for the emotional toll of reliving their pain in a sterile courtroom, was perhaps the hardest part of my job. I saw the fear in their eyes, the doubt that flickered despite their conviction, and I knew my task was not just to inform, but to fortify. We held mock trials, practicing their testimony, anticipating every trick Thorne's high-priced legal team might employ. We dissected their medical histories, their employment records, their personal lives, preparing them for the inevitable character assassinations and attempts to paint them as opportunistic or mentally unstable. It was a brutal process, but a necessary one. The trial itself was a maelstrom of legal maneuvering and human drama. From the moment we stepped into the imposing courthouse, the air crackled with tension. Thorne Inc. had brought in a formidable defense, led by a sharp-suited, silver-haired lawyer named Sterling Vance, whose reputation for dismantling plaintiffs was legendary. He exuded an icy confidence, his gaze sweeping over our small, determined group with an almost palpable disdain. Our own lead counsel, a seasoned litigator named Evelyn Reed, was a quiet force, her brilliance lying in her meticulous preparation and her ability to weave complex facts into a compelling narrative. She had the wisdom of years and the fire of a true believer, a rare combination. Jury selection alone took weeks. Vance's team tried to weed out anyone with even a remote connection to environmental activism or a history of illness, while Evelyn sought out individuals who demonstrated empathy, critical thinking, and a sense of justice. It was a psychological chess match, each side trying to predict human nature, to sculpt a panel that might lean their way. I sat in the back, observing, taking notes, feeling every subtle shift in expression, every hesitant answer. The weight of so many lives rested on these 12 strangers. The opening statements were a stark contrast. Vance, with his booming voice and theatrical gestures, painted Thorne as a responsible corporate citizen, a pillar of the community, unfairly targeted by a few disgruntled. Was that this was a one-off, a bad actor trying to exploit a loophole. But the more I dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were patterns. Other buildings, other tenants, similar vague eviction notices. Some had fought, some had moved out, defeated by the sheer legal firepower Thorne could bring to bear. The stories I found online, buried in obscure tenant rights forums, painted a consistent picture. Thorne Properties would buy a building, issue these questionable notices, and then, after tenants were gone, would either renovate minimally and drastically raise rents, or simply sell the empty building for a massive profit. It was a systematic, calculated campaign of displacement. I decided my first official move would be a direct communication with Thorne Properties. I drafted a formal letter, citing the specific legal flaws in their eviction notice, demanding its immediate withdrawal, and reminding them of my mother's long-standing tenancy and good standing. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, and also followed up with an email to their general legal counsel, whose name I'd unearthed from one of the corporate filings. I made sure my tone was firm, professional, and left no doubt that they were dealing with someone who understood the law. I wanted them to know they hadn't just picked on a quiet, elderly woman. They'd picked on her son, a real estate attorney. The response was swift and predictably dismissive. A junior associate from Thorne's legal team sent back a curt email, reiterating their position, claiming the notice was valid, and warning against any attempts to obstruct their redevelopment plans. There was no apology, no attempt at negotiation, just a thinly veiled threat. It was boilerplate, standard operating procedure for them, designed to wear down any resistance. But for me, it was a confirmation. They weren't going to back down easily. They believed they were untouchable. That's when my resolve hardened into something cold and unyielding. This wasn't just about protecting my mother anymore. This was about exposing a predator who was preying on the most vulnerable members of our community. This was about dismantling an entire operation, piece by painful piece, until Victor Thorne had nowhere left to hide. My legal training, my years of navigating complex property disputes, all of it suddenly coalesced into a singular, powerful purpose. I started building my case, not just for my mother, but for every tenant Thorne Properties had wronged. I began reaching out to tenant advocacy groups, explaining what I was seeing. Their response was immediate. They knew Thorne, they had files, but they often lacked the resources or the individual legal expertise to take on such a well-funded and legally aggressive entity head-on. Now, they had me, and I had a personal stake. My investigation deepened. I spent nights poring over property tax records, zoning variances, building permits. I discovered that Thorne Properties frequently applied for minor renovation permits, not full redevelopment permits, which would have triggered stricter tenant relocation requirements. Individuals seeking a payout. He spoke of scientific uncertainty, of natural variability, of the complex tapestry of human health. Evelyn, in her measured, calm tones, laid out our case like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. She spoke of the company's internal memos, of the suppressed reports, of the gradual poisoning of a community for profit. She introduced the human element, the faces behind the statistics, the names of the dead and the suffering. Her voice, though soft, resonated with an undeniable authority, and I saw a few jurors lean forward, their expressions thoughtful. Then came the testimony. Maria was our first key witness. She walked to the stand with a cane, her once vibrant posture now stooped, her face etched with years of grief and illness. Her voice, though still trembling as I had anticipated, carried an unexpected strength as she recounted the story of her family. She spoke of her husband, a hard-working man who had built their home with his own hands, slowly wasting away from a rare form of cancer. She described her children, one born with severe developmental issues, another battling chronic respiratory ailments since childhood. She spoke of the well water they drank, the air they breathed, the garden they tended, all now tainted by Thorne's pollution. Vance's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned her memory, her lifestyle choices, her medical history, implying her family's illnesses were due to pre-existing conditions, poor diet, or simply bad luck. He tried to break her, to make her cry, to reduce her to a pitiable figure rather than a credible witness. But Maria, though tears welled in her eyes, held firm. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "My family was healthy, sir. We were healthy until Thorne came." Her simple, unadorned truth cut through the legal theatrics, and I saw a few jurors visibly react. Dr. Eris followed. He was a revelation. His calm, academic demeanor lent immense credibility to his testimony. He detailed the specific chemicals, their known toxic effects, the pathways of exposure, and the statistical correlation between Thorne's emissions and the surge in specific diseases in the community. He presented complex data with clarity, using diagrams and charts that Evelyn had helped him simplify. Vance tried to discredit him, questioning his methodology, his funding, even his professional ethics. He accused Dr. Eris of being an activist, of having a personal vendetta against Thorne. But Eris, unflappable, responded with facts, with peer-reviewed studies, with the cold, hard logic of science. He explained how Thorne's own internal studies, which he had leaked, had shown early warnings of contamination, warnings that had been deliberately ignored or suppressed. It was a devastating blow to Thorne's defense, exposing a deliberate pattern of negligence. The parade of witnesses continued for weeks. Farmers spoke of poisoned livestock and barren fields. Factory workers, many of whom had once worked for Thorne, recounted the lax safety protocols, the open dumping, the dismissive attitude of management towards environmental concerns. Retirees, their golden years stolen by chronic pain and debilitating illnesses, shared their stories of fear and betrayal. Each testimony was a small, sharp shard of truth, slowly piecing together a mosaic of corporate malfeasance and human suffering. My job during this period was a constant balancing act, supporting the witnesses emotionally, coordinating with Evelyn's team on presentation, and meticulously cross-referencing every detail to preempt Vance's inevitable challenges. I felt the weight of their trust, their hope, their desperation. It fueled me, even as it exhausted me. Thorne's defense was relentless. They presented their own experts, scientists, who argued that the chemicals were within acceptable limits, that the illnesses were multifactorial, that our data was flawed. They brought in epidemiologists who claimed our statistical correlations were coincidental, not causal. They even attempted to introduce evidence suggesting that some of our witnesses had other health issues, or had engaged in behaviors that could have contributed to their ailments, a transparent attempt to muddy the waters and shift blame. Evelyn and her team were prepared for most of it. We had anticipated their arguments, having spent months dissecting Thorne's publicly available research and hiring our own independent experts to counter their claims. The courtroom became a battleground of scientific jargon, statistical models, and conflicting interpretations, each side vying for the jury's understanding and belief. One particularly difficult moment came when Vance's team tried to paint our entire community as financially motivated, suggesting that the lawsuit was an opportunistic grab for money. They brought up old news articles about other environmental disputes, trying to establish a pattern of litigiousness. Evelyn, during her redirect examination, countered this by having several witnesses explain that they had initially tried to work with Thorne, appealing to them directly for help, only to be met with stonewalling and denial. Maria, when recalled, spoke powerfully about how no amount of money could bring back her husband or heal her children, that their fight was for justice, for accountability, and to prevent this from happening to anyone else. Her words resonated deeply, pushing back against Vance's cynical narrative. The trials stretched into months. The initial adrenaline rush gave way to a grinding marathon of evidence, objections, and cross-examinations. My days blurred into a cycle of early mornings in the war room, intense hours in the courthouse, and late nights debriefing with Evelyn and her team. I slept little, fueled by coffee and an unwavering sense of purpose. I saw the toll it took on everyone, especially the witnesses, who had to relive their traumas day after day. I became their confidant, their advocate, their emotional anchor. I saw the dark circles under Evelyn's eyes, the slight tremor in her hand during a particularly contentious argument, but her resolve never wavered. We were a small army against a corporate giant, and we knew the stakes were impossibly high. A pivotal moment occurred during the testimony of a former Thorne engineer, a man named Robert Jenkins, who had initially been reluctant to come forward. He had worked for the company for 30 years before retiring, and his conscience had finally gotten the better of him. He testified about specific instances of improper waste disposal, of falsified reports, and of direct orders from senior management to cut corners on environmental safety to save costs. He even produced a hidden logbook he had kept, detailing dates, times, and names associated with these illicit activities. Vance's cross-examination of Jenkins was ferocious, accusing him of being a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. But Jenkins, a quiet, unassuming man, held his ground, his testimony backed by his meticulously kept records. He had nothing to gain, he said, only the peace of mind of telling the truth. The logbook, authenticated by our experts, became a cornerstone of our case, providing irrefutable internal evidence of Thorne's deliberate malfeasance. The closing arguments were the culmination of everything. Vance, slick and persuasive, delivered a masterful performance, weaving together doubts, uncertainties, and alternative explanations, trying to leave just enough ambiguity in the jurors' minds to avoid a conviction. He spoke of the burden of proof, of the enormous implications of a verdict against a major corporation. Evelyn, in contrast, spoke directly to the human cost. She revisited the stories of Maria, of Dr. Eris, of the farmers and the factory workers. She laid out the evidence in a clear, concise manner, connecting each piece of the puzzle to show a deliberate pattern of neglect and deception. She ended not with a plea for sympathy, but with a demand for justice, for accountability, for a clear message that no corporation was above the law, above the health and safety of the people it impacted. Her voice, though calm, was filled with a righteous indignation that pierced the courtroom's solemnity. The jury retired to deliberate. The waiting period was excruciating. Every minute felt like an hour, every hour a day. The community gathered outside the courthouse, a silent vigil, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. I sat in the war room with Evelyn and her team, trying to focus on mundane tasks, but my mind kept replaying every argument, every piece of evidence, every fleeting expression on a juror's face. Had we done enough? Had we made it clear enough? Had we touched their hearts as well as their minds? The uncertainty was a heavy cloak. Days turned into a week. Rumors swirled. A hung jury. A quick decision. Each new report sent waves of anxiety through our small group. I saw Maria, her face pale but resolute, sitting outside the courtroom every day, a silent testament to her unwavering belief. I knew we couldn't fail her, couldn't fail any of them. Then, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed, standing room only. The air was thick with anticipation. Thorne's executives sat stiffly, their faces unreadable. Vance stood beside them, his usual composure slightly frayed. Our side: Evelyn, myself, Maria, and a few other key witnesses, sat together, our hands clasped, our breaths held. The judge entered. The bailiff called for order, and the jury filed in, their faces giving away nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs. The foreperson, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, stood. The judge asked for the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thorn, Inc., liable on all counts. The words hung in the air, then a collective gasp, a ripple of murmurs. My breath hitched. Evelyn squeezed my hand, her eyes shining. Maria burst into tears, silent, racking sobs of relief and grief. I felt a wave of emotion wash over me: exhaustion, triumph, profound sadness for all that had been lost, and immense gratitude for the justice that had finally been served. It was not a joyous celebration, but a profound exhalation, a collective recognition that truth had prevailed. The judge read the details of the damages awarded, a staggering sum, one that would provide compensation for the victims and, more importantly, send an undeniable message to corporations everywhere. Outside, the community erupted in a roar: cheers, tears, embraces. It was a moment of catharsis, a release of years of pent-up anger, fear, and sorrow. I watched Maria being embraced by her neighbors, her face wet with tears but now also alight with a fragile hope. Dr. Aris, usually so reserved, allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. I found Evelyn, and we shared a quiet moment, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental effort, the personal sacrifices, and the profound victory we had achieved together. The legal battle was far from over, of course. Thorn immediately announced its intention to appeal, a move we had fully anticipated. But the verdict, the initial, powerful declaration of their liability, was a monumental first step. It validated the suffering, it exposed the truth, and it gave the community a tangible victory, a foundation upon which to rebuild. The financial compensation would help with medical bills, with lost livelihoods, with the immense burden placed upon them, but the verdict's true value lay in its affirmation of their humanity, their right to a safe environment, and their power to fight back against seemingly insurmountable odds. In the days and weeks that followed, the media coverage was extensive. Thorn's stock plummeted. Investigations were launched by federal agencies. The case became a precedent, a beacon of hope for other communities battling corporate polluters. My role shifted again. The immediate frenzy of the trial gave way to the complex work of managing the appeal, ensuring the integrity of the original verdict, and beginning the process of allocating compensation to the victims. I worked closely with Evelyn, who now became a national figure, her quiet determination lauded in legal circles. We established a trust fund, a transparent process for distributing the funds, and continued to advocate for stricter environmental regulations. The fight for true environmental justice, for a world where corporations are held fully accountable for their actions, was still ongoing. The scars on the land and on the people would take generations to heal, if they ever truly did. But we had won a battle, a significant one. The air in our town, though still carrying the ghosts of the past, felt a little lighter, a little cleaner. The water, though still requiring filtration, carried a renewed promise. And the community, once fractured by fear and despair, was now united by a shared victory, a testament to their resilience and their unwavering belief in justice. I often revisited the faces of the witnesses, the raw emotion in their testimonies, the quiet strength they had shown. Maria, her voice still echoing in my mind, her simple truth that had cut through the legal jargon. Dr. Aris, whose courage had exposed the deliberate deception. They were not just victims, they were heroes, and I was immensely proud to have stood by their side. My own path, once a winding road of idealism and frustration, now felt clearer, more defined. The work was hard, ceaseless, and often heartbreaking, but it was profoundly meaningful. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was where I belonged, on the front lines of the fight for a better, more just world. The verdict was not an end, but a powerful beginning, a roar that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls, reminding everyone that even the smallest voices, when united, could make the mightiest corporations tremble. The future remained uncertain, but hope, once a fragile ember, now burned brighter than ever, fueled by the embers of justice we had painstakingly ignited. They were using a loophole, claiming minor repairs while subtly pushing out tenants, then selling the empty units at market rates. The paperwork was a labyrinth of legal cunning, designed to obfuscate rather than clarify. I started mapping out Thorne's empire. Using public databases, I created a visual representation of all the properties owned by Thorne Properties and its various subsidiaries. It was a spiderweb, intricate and far-reaching, encompassing dozens of buildings across several neighborhoods. I noticed a pattern. Many of these properties were clustered in areas undergoing gentrification, neighborhoods where older, affordable housing was being systematically replaced by luxury developments. My mother's building fit the profile perfectly. It was a prime location, ripe for a flip. The next step was to find other victims. I started cold calling, using the information from the tenant forums and public records to identify former and current tenants of Thorne Properties. It was slow, sometimes disheartening work. Many people were afraid. Some had already moved on, exhausted by the fight. But gradually I started finding them. A retired teacher forced out of her home after 40 years, a young family evicted on dubious grounds, a small business owner who lost his storefront to a sudden rent hike. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, a testament to Thorne's ruthlessness. I meticulously documented every conversation, every detail, every piece of paper they could provide. I was building a dossier, a comprehensive indictment of Thorne's entire operation. I learned about his tactics, the subtle intimidation, the constant pressure, the sudden, unexplained maintenance issues, designed to make life uncomfortable for long-term tenants. One woman told me how her heating would inexplicably fail every winter, only to be fixed weeks later, just long enough for her to get sick of the cold. Another recounted how Thorne's contractors would start loud, disruptive work at odd hours, making it impossible to live peacefully. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a playbook, a systematic effort to create a hostile living environment, pushing tenants to break their leases and move out voluntarily. My mother, bless her heart, tried to remain positive, but I could see the toll it was taking. She'd jump every time the doorbell rang, fearing it was another official notice. She'd sometimes call me late at night, asking if I was sure everything would be okay. Her anxiety fueled my determination. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about restoring her peace of mind, about showing her that bullies, even powerful ones, could be brought to justice. I also began to dig into Victor Thorne himself. He was a master of public relations, presenting himself as a benevolent developer, a community builder. He sat on various charitable boards, donated to local causes, and even had a glossy profile in a local business magazine, portraying him as a visionary. But behind that polished facade, I was uncovering a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back years. This wasn't a man who made a few mistakes. This was a man who had built an empire on the backs of others, systematically exploiting legal loopholes and the vulnerabilities of his tenants. The sheer scale of his operation was staggering. He had a network of property managers, legal teams, and even what seemed to be a network of informants within city planning departments, giving him advance notice of zoning changes or redevelopment opportunities. He was a spider at the center of a very large, very sticky web, and I was about to walk right into it, not as an unsuspecting fly, but as a wrecking ball. I continued to gather evidence, copies of old leases, utility bills, photographs of neglected repairs, emails from other tenants describing similar experiences. I even found a former employee of Thorne Properties, who, after a bitter falling out, was willing to provide some invaluable insights into the internal workings of the company, shedding light on their tactics and the specific individuals involved in their more questionable practices. This was a significant breakthrough, offering a glimpse behind the curtain of Thorne's carefully constructed empire. The employee, a disgruntled property manager, confirmed my suspicions about the systematic nature of their eviction strategies and the deliberate use of legal ambiguities to their advantage. He described how Thorne would instruct them to create minor inconveniences for long-term tenants, Always just enough to be annoying, but not quite enough to be a clear violation of tenant rights. Things like delayed repairs, sudden noise complaints from non-existent neighbors, or even strategically timed inspections that felt more like harassment. Each piece of information, each document, each testimony was like a brick in a wall I was building. A wall of evidence designed to box Thorne in, to expose his entire operation for what it truly was. This wasn't going to be a quick fight. I knew that. Thorne had resources, influence, and a legal team that was well-versed in delaying tactics and aggressive defense. But I also knew I had something they didn't: personal motivation, an intimate understanding of their target, and a growing mountain of undeniable truth. My Sundays with my mother became less about fixing leaky faucets and more about strategy sessions. I'd explain my progress, simplify the legal jargon for her, and show her the evidence I was collecting. Seeing her understanding grow, seeing the flicker of hope return to her eyes, was all the fuel I needed. She started remembering details, things she'd dismissed as trivial at the time, but which now, in the context of Thorne's pattern of behavior, became significant. A contractor who seemed to deliberately damage a pipe during a routine check, only for the repair to take weeks. A sudden, unjustified increase in her utilities that she'd just paid without questioning. Every memory, every detail, was another thread I could pull. I began to formulate my legal strategy. It wasn't enough to just fight the eviction notice for my mother. That would be a small victory, a temporary reprieve. Thorne would simply pivot, try another tactic, or move on to his next victim. No, I needed to hit him where it hurt, to expose the systemic nature of his corruption, and to ensure he couldn't continue to exploit vulnerable tenants. This meant building a case that went beyond a simple landlord-tenant dispute. It meant looking into class action possibilities, regulatory violations, and even potential criminal misconduct if the evidence supported it. The more I delved, the more I realized that Thorne wasn't just a landlord. He was a disruptor, but not in the innovative sense. He was disrupting lives, communities, and the very fabric of stable housing for profit. His operations were a carefully orchestrated dance on the edge of legality, always pushing boundaries, always exploiting gray areas. He had a reputation for being ruthless, for wearing down opponents with sheer legal force and financial might. Many had tried to fight him, and many had failed. But I wasn't just another tenant or another lawyer. I was a son protecting his mother, and that gave me a different kind of strength, a different kind of resolve. I started spending late nights in my office, surrounded by stacks of documents, highlighted passages, and my own handwritten notes. My coffee intake quadrupled. My friends would call, asking if I was still alive, and I'd give them vague answers about a complex case. I couldn't tell them everything, not yet. This was too personal, too volatile. I needed to move in silence, to gather my forces, before making any overt moves. I even paid a visit to the city's housing authority, posing as a concerned citizen researching local housing trends. I subtly probed about Thorne properties, asking about their track record, their compliance history. The officials were tight-lipped, but their evasiveness, their quick deflection, spoke volumes. It suggested that Thorne had either cultivated relationships within the authority or had managed to keep his operations just below the radar of serious investigation. This only strengthened my conviction that a direct, head-on assault was necessary, one that would force these issues into the light. I also reached out to a few trusted colleagues in the legal community. First was Marcus Thorne, no relation to the man I was hunting, a sharp corporate attorney I'd known since law school. Marcus had a knack for dissecting complex financial structures, for seeing the hidden veins of power and money. I presented him with a sanitized version of my findings, enough to pique his interest without revealing the full extent of my personal connection. I told him I was looking into a pattern of predatory real estate practices, specifically targeting vulnerable communities, and that the main player seemed to be Thorne Properties. I needed someone to follow the money, to unearth any shell corporations, any offshore accounts, any legal but ethically dubious maneuvers that might be facilitating their actions. Marcus, always up for a challenge, agreed to take a look, his eyes gleaming with the intellectual thrill of the chase. He warned me it would be a deep dive, a labyrinth of paperwork, but he promised to keep me updated. My second contact was Sarah Jensen, a tenacious investigative journalist whose work had brought down more than one corrupt politician and shady corporation. Sarah operated with a quiet ferocity, her pen a scalpel for truth. I met her in a dimly lit cafe, choosing a back corner booth where our conversation would be less likely to be overheard. I spoke in generalities at first, sketching the outline of a large-scale housing exploitation scheme. I explained the systemic nature of the problem, the whispers of intimidation, the fear among tenants. Sarah listened intently, her gaze unwavering, occasionally jotting notes in a small, leather-bound notebook. She understood the importance of building a solid foundation before going public, the need for irrefutable evidence. I told her that when the time came, when I had assembled a comprehensive dossier, I would need her help to amplify the story, to ensure it reached the widest possible audience. She simply nodded, a silent promise hanging in the air between us. Her parting words were a simple admonition. Be careful, this kind of fight often attracts unwanted attention. My days blurred into a relentless cycle of research, analysis, and clandestine meetings. I found myself adopting habits I hadn't realized I possessed, like constantly checking my rearview mirror, or varying my routes home. The line between professional diligence and personal obsession grew increasingly thin. My apartment, once a sanctuary, transformed into a war room. Maps of the city were tacked to a corkboard, pushpins marking Thorn properties, various holdings, color-coded to indicate demographics, eviction rates, and reported tenant complaints. Red pins clustered densely in the poorer districts, a stark visual representation of their predatory focus. Marcus's initial reports began to trickle in, confirming my suspicions. Thorn Properties was not a single entity but a web of limited liability companies, each seemingly independent, yet all ultimately feeding into a central holding company registered in a tax haven notorious for its opaque financial regulations. It was a classic corporate shell game, designed to obscure ownership, limit liability, and make it incredibly difficult to trace the flow of funds. He uncovered a complex series of intercompany loans, asset transfers, and management fees that effectively siphoned profits away from the operating entities, making them appear less profitable on paper while enriching the hidden beneficiaries. The true beneficiaries, Marcus suspected, were likely a small group of individuals, with Elias Thorn at the apex. He was exceptionally good at hiding his tracks. Digging deeper into the human element, I began to search for other victims. This was more challenging. Fear was a powerful deterrent. Many tenants I attempted to contact either refused to speak or offered only vague, frightened denials of any wrongdoing by their landlord. It was a familiar pattern, the same fear that had silenced my parents for so long. But I persisted. I frequented community centers, attended neighborhood watch meetings, and spent hours in local cafes, simply listening. Slowly, painstakingly, I started to identify individuals who had been evicted under questionable circumstances, or who had experienced sudden, exorbitant rent increases, or who had faced relentless pressure to vacate their homes. One such person was an elderly woman named Maria Rodriguez. She lived in a small, rent-controlled apartment that Thorn Properties had acquired a few years prior. Her story was heartbreakingly familiar. After the acquisition, the building had fallen into disrepair. Leaks went unfixed. Heating systems failed in winter, and pest infestations became rampant. When Maria and her neighbors complained, they were met with indifference, sometimes even veiled threats. Eventually, Thorn Properties offered a buyout, a pittance, compared to the actual value of her decades-long tenancy. When she refused, the harassment escalated. Suddenly, she was facing spurious complaints about noise, about imaginary violations of her lease. She had fought back, but the emotional and financial toll had been immense. She was exhausted, living in constant anxiety. Meeting Maria was a turning point. Her weary eyes, her trembling hands as she recounted her ordeal, solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about all the Marias, all the voiceless victims caught in Thorn's Thorne's predatory grasp. It became a crusade, a quiet, simmering rebellion against the systemic exploitation that had become their hallmark. My personal vendetta, while still a burning ember, transformed into a larger fire, fueled by the collective injustice I now saw so clearly. I spent the next few weeks submerged in research. My old law school textbooks, once gathering dust, were now spread across my kitchen table, dog-eared and highlighted. I delved into housing law, tenant rights, corporate negligence, and the often murky waters of real estate acquisition. I revisited every news article one could find about Thorne Properties, not just the glowing press releases, but the small, buried local reports of protests, tenant grievances, and unexplained evictions. The pattern was undeniable. They would acquire older, often rent-controlled buildings, let them deteriorate, then push out long-term residents through a combination of neglect, intimidation, and paltry buyouts, clearing the way for luxury renovations and skyrocketing rents. It was a playbook, cold and calculated, executed with ruthless efficiency. Maria became my first unofficial case study, a living testament to Thorne's methods. I spent hours with her, meticulously documenting her timeline, collecting every tattered notice, every ignored repair request, every threatening letter. Her initial reluctance slowly gave way to a fierce desire for justice, not just for herself, but for her neighbors, who had already succumbed to the pressure. She connected me with a few of them, individuals who had accepted the buyouts out of sheer exhaustion or fear, their stories mirroring hers with chilling precision. They were hesitant to speak out formally, scarred by their experiences, but their whispered accounts provided crucial corroboration. My apartment, once a sanctuary, became a war room. Maps of the city were tacked to the walls, red pins marking Thorne Properties, various acquisitions. I started building a database, cross-referencing addresses with public records, looking for patterns in property transfers, building code violations, and tenant complaints filed with city agencies. It was tedious work, often frustrating, but every small discovery felt like a victory. I found a cluster of buildings in a historically working-class neighborhood that had all been acquired by Thorne within a 2-year period. The stories coming out of those buildings were identical to Maria's. It was a factory of misery, churning out profit from human suffering. I knew I couldn't do this alone. The scale of the problem was too vast. My legal background was a foundation, but I lacked the resources, the network, and, frankly, the experience to take on a corporate giant like Thorne Properties single-handedly. I reached out to a former professor, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a formidable advocate for social justice and a renowned expert in tenant law. I had always admired her fierce intellect and unwavering commitment to the underdog. She was initially cautious, her years of fighting similar battles having taught her a healthy dose of skepticism. But as I laid out my findings, presenting her with Maria's testimony and the growing stack of evidence, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a familiar fire igniting. We met in her cluttered office, surrounded by towering stacks of legal briefs and dusty tomes. I spoke for nearly 2 hours, detailing Thorne's modus operandi, the psychological warfare, the legal loopholes they exploited. She listened intently, occasionally interjecting with sharp, incisive questions. When I finished, a long silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of her ancient computer. She finally spoke, her voice low and gravelly. "This is bigger than you think," she said. "Thorne Properties has deep pockets and even deeper connections. They've been doing this for years, perfecting their strategy. Many have tried to fight them. Most have failed. I understood the warning, but it didn't deter me. That's why I need your help," I told her. "This isn't just about my family's building anymore. It's about stopping them, truly stopping them." Dr. Reed leaned back in her worn leather chair, her gaze fixed on a framed photograph of a young woman holding a protest sign. She sighed. "All right," she said. "Let's see what we can do. But understand, this will be a long, brutal fight. They will come at you with everything they have. They will try to discredit you, intimidate you, bury you in paperwork. Are you ready for that?" I met her gaze, my resolve unwavering. "I'm ready," I affirmed. "I have to be." With Dr. Reed's guidance, our efforts gained momentum. She connected me with a small, dedicated team of legal aid lawyers and community organizers who had been independently battling various aspects of Thorne's predatory practices. There was David, a young, idealistic attorney fresh out of law school, whose passion for justice was infectious. He was meticulous, tireless, and unafraid of the mountain of paperwork ahead. Then there was Lena, a seasoned community organizer with decades of experience mobilizing residents and navigating local politics. She had a deep understanding of the city's neighborhoods, a network of contacts, and an uncanny ability to inspire trust in wary tenants. Our first major hurdle was convincing more victims to come forward. Fear was a powerful deterrent. Many tenants, particularly the elderly or those with precarious immigration status, were terrified of retaliation. Thorne's reputation for ruthlessness preceded them. Lena proved invaluable here. She organized discreet community meetings in church basements and community centers, away from Thorne's watchful eyes. She spoke their language, understood their fears, and offered them a glimmer of hope. Slowly, cautiously, more Mariahs began to emerge from the shadows. Their stories painted an even grimmer picture. One elderly woman recounted how her heating had been deliberately shut off for weeks in the dead of winter, forcing her to rely on a small, dangerous space heater. A young family with 2 small children described how their apartment had become infested with cockroaches and rats. After Thorne took over, their complaints met with shrugs and empty promises. A disabled veteran spoke of how his accessibility ramps had been removed during a superficial renovation, making his own home a prison. Each narrative was a fresh wound, a new layer of outrage adding to the growing dossier against Thorne. We realized the individual lawsuits, while important, wouldn't be enough. Thorne would simply drag them out, bleed the plaintiffs dry, and settle for pennies on the dollar, continuing their operations unhindered. We needed something bigger, something that would hit them where it hurt, their public image and their bottom line. A class action lawsuit seemed like the most potent weapon, but building one required an immense amount of coordination and irrefutable evidence. David, with his youthful energy, took on the Herculean task of organizing the testimonies and documents. He created a sophisticated database, cross-referencing tenant names, building addresses, dates of acquisition, types of complaints, and the responses, or lack thereof, from Thorne properties. The patterns became starker, more damning with each new entry. It wasn't just neglect. It was a calculated strategy of constructive eviction. My role shifted to legal strategy, working closely with Dr. Reed. We scoured legal precedents, looking for similar cases, exploring every possible avenue to prove intent and systemic wrongdoing. We knew Thorne's legal team would be formidable, well-versed in delaying tactics and exploiting every ambiguity in the law. We had to be smarter, more prepared, and utterly relentless. The pressure began to mount. Thorne properties, like a wounded beast, started to sense the growing threat. We saw subtle signs at first, anonymous calls to some of the more outspoken tenants, thinly veiled threats about lease violations or immigration status. Then came the more direct attacks. A local news report, clearly planted by Thorne's PR machine, painted our efforts as a frivolous attempt by disgruntled tenants to extort money. It dismissed our claims as baseless, portraying Thorne properties as a benevolent,